Well, I think for pretty much all the states, nuclear weapons do not really play a vital role in their nuclear security strategy, in a sense that the reality is that the benefits of nuclear weapons are actually quite minimal, even though most nuclear weapon states do believe that this is an important part of their defense posture. But again, if you look at the nuclear security of the United States or Russia, for that matter, or China, there is very little that today these countries actually gain from having nuclear weapons. If you go a little bit broader and ask the kind of what national security means, then you would see that the protection of your country from external invasion is actually a very, very small part of that. So I would say that yes, people do believe that nuclear weapons play an important role in their national security, but I think the reality is that this role is actually smaller and smaller every day, actually. It's a good sign that people don't really kind of keep nuclear weapons on their minds all the time, as they actually was the case during the Cold War, at least at some periods of the Cold War. That was a really kind of a pressing issue. But at the same time, there is a danger there, which is precisely that once you neglect these weapons, they don't disappear. They continue to be there. They live the life of their own. At some point, we could have an accident precisely because we've neglected this whole problem. For example, again, it's not like we don't have evidence. We do have evidence of that. For example, the 6 nuclear weapons that were flown that actually were lost by the United States for more than a day in 2007. I mean, that's a very good example of the kind of accidents that happen when you sort of delegate, you put nuclear weapons on back burner, sort of you don't think about them anymore. Well, there is on many levels there is a very close relationship, because the technologies are in many cases are pretty much the same. So actually having the nuclear energy enterprise actually does help a country to have, if not the real capability to manufacture nuclear weapons, but at least the kind of what people usually call a virtual capability or theoretical capability. It doesn't have to be kind of directly linked in the sense that there is no specific reason why a country with a nuclear expertise should decide to go and develop nuclear weapons. But the capability will be there, and I think there is no kind of technical fix to this problem. It is something that requires actually a set of measures, if you will, and an international environment in which countries would not feel that they have to think about developing nuclear weapon capability, even if they have the technology to do so. Well, enrichment is one of the steps that you would need in most of the nuclear power generation programs, not all of them. The problem with enrichment is that once you have the capability to enrich uranium for nuclear reactors, which is low enriched uranium, so it's something that you cannot really use in any weapon program. Once you have this capability, then it's fairly easy to go from there to actually the capability to produce weapon-grade material. And another problem is that the modern uranium enrichment technologies, they are actually quite invisible. They are very hard to detect. The gas centrifuges, for example, you could build a fairly advanced and very capable facility without anybody knowing anything about it, and that's also that could present certain problems from a proliferation point of view. Then another aspect of this problem is the civilian plutonium, the circulation of plutonium in the nuclear fuel cycle. That actually presents a fairly significant risk as well, because the amounts of material are very, very large. It is being used very actively. I think if you look at the way the process is done, for example, in France, that is actively using its reactor-grade plutonium for fuel fabrication, it is actually, the material is shipped regularly. The material is regularly driven from the north of the country to the south of the country, just as plutonium, and that's not a very secure arrangement to have. In many ways, if you have a very large nuclear energy complex, that, as we discussed, that actually allows for a spread of technologies, facilities, technical capabilities, expertise. That makes proliferation easier. But that doesn't mean that if you sort of shut down all nuclear power plants that you would eliminate the danger of nuclear proliferation entirely. No, not at all. Again, the key, it would make it more difficult in many cases, but by no means impossible. So again, there is no easy solution to the problem. So it's not like if we could just eliminate nuclear energy, we will have no nuclear proliferation. That, unfortunately, that doesn't quite work that way. Well, safeguards is an interesting issue, and we definitely need them. I mean, there is no doubt about that. So, because they do provide a certain degree or fairly high degree of confidence that, for example, the material is not being diverted and that all the activity stays on the civilian side. But at the same time, I think we should also understand that there are limits to what safeguards could do, and I think the case of Iran demonstrates very clearly that when it gets tricky, when it gets into some gray area of intentions and some unclear evidence, disputed evidence, then it's very difficult actually to get a definitive answer to any of the questions that the safeguards are supposed to answer. Strengthening the safeguard system would probably help quite a bit in kind of deterring countries from trying to circumvent safeguards. But at the same time, I don't think that many countries are trying to circumvent safeguards. So it in many ways, again, we are dealing with the issue that we know that people are not trying to cheat. So yes, it is very valuable to have the proof that they are not trying to cheat. But on some level, it doesn't mean that when someone will try to cheat, that the safeguards will provide kind of a very strong mechanism for dealing with that. The larger point is that safeguards are an important instrument, but they are just an instrument in a larger arrangement that would have to make sure that countries don't try to develop nuclear weapons capability. That would be the most effective way of dealing with the non-proliferation issue. I don't think anybody should be allowed to have nuclear weapons. That's the... Well, I'm actually fairly optimistic on that score. I mean, if we're talking about complete nuclear disarmament, I do think that it's a realistic goal, and largely because, as I mentioned, there is a good case to be made that basically nuclear weapons don't add anything to your security, and that case has been made by a number of people, including the George Shultz and Kissinger and Bill Perry and Sam Nunn, who also argued that there are risks and benefits, and the benefits, whatever they are, they certainly don't outweigh the risk. And I would probably emphasize again that I don't see that there are benefits at all in having nuclear weapons, and certainly there are risks. So there is just no rational, quote-unquote, case for having nuclear weapons today as an instrument of policy or instrument of national security. So, but again, it will take time for people to realize that that's the case, and to adjust their policies, and to make sure that they are sort of comfortable with this notion that nuclear weapons are actually not that useful to them anymore. I could imagine in an international environment in which we don't necessarily care that much about this kind of capability, but we are not there yet, and I don't think that we have a clear path from where we are today to the world in which, for example, nobody would particularly care about whether Iran has the enrichment capability or not. If nuclear weapon states would eliminate their nuclear arsenals, that would be a very big step toward the international arrangement, or the international environment in which countries would not really want to develop nuclear weapon capability. So I think that that's a very important element. So the establishing a norm in which not having nuclear weapons is actually the right thing to do, the normal thing to do. So we are pretty far off from that, but I think that that's the important goal, and I think there is a general understanding that this is the only way to get to the kind of environment that we're talking about, in which countries don't really think about developing nuclear weapon capability. I think the jury is still out whether actually supporting nuclear energy is the most cost-effective way of dealing with the carbon issue, for example. So I think what will probably happen in the next decade or so is that we will see certain kind of a movement. There will be some development of nuclear power in the countries that already have it, and in some new countries as well. But eventually the cost, as I said, the cost is actually very, very high, and I don't think that the countries that are trying to enter into this nuclear generation business, that they actually have the clear picture of what's involved. We should not look at nuclear power in isolation, and we should compare not just the actual carbon emissions, but the cost of reducing those emissions. And it is well may be that by, for example, building natural gas plants with the same amount of money, you could replace more coal-burning plants. And so in the end, you could get more significant reductions of emissions, even though you don't sort of eliminate them to the extent that you probably could if you go all the way nuclear. So it is not. I think it's not a clear-cut case that nuclear is the best way, if you will, of dealing with carbon emissions. And then there is another part of this problem is, again, as I said, I mean, nuclear power is very expensive, and it's very centralized. It has all this kind of side effects, the non-proliferation and safety concerns and others. And it may well be that in the long run, it is better for countries to invest in alternative sources, whether it's renewables or other sources of energy, rather than to try to kind of put more and more money into nuclear. These are, as I said, these are not the very straightforward straightforward issues, and they do require analysis of the energy generating system as a whole. I'm Pavel Podvig. I'm the program lead of the WND program at UNIDIR here in Geneva, and I'm a director of the Russian Nuclear Forces project.